What's up, guys? This is Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, and on this episode, we're going to recap Week 2 in the Premier Lacrosse League, all 4 games from this past weekend. We'll update PLL Player Royale, as well as our Week 2 bets from last Thursday's episode. We'll also update the weekly power rankings as well, and we'll finish it all off, as always, getting your thoughts in the mix from Week 2 in Charlotte. So just to jump right into this Week 2 recap here in segment number 1, go over some of those bets we had in the picks segment of last Thursday's show. Some wins that we got this weekend: the Chrome, the Atlas, and the Whipsnakes on the money line. Mike Chanenchuk over 1.5, and Mac O'Keefe as well going over 1.5 points on the weekend. Some losses we took this week: the Chaos money line, Jules Henningberg over 2.5 didn't happen. Obviously, the Redwoods, as we'll talk about throughout this episode, struggled heavily, and I do mean heavily, offensively this past weekend. And then that Atlas Cannons game was a tricky one, I'll admit. We lost out on the over 24.5. Just my luck, it was 24, I believe, was the final total in that one. And the Cannons plus 2.5. I really did think, even despite Lyle Thompson being absent from that game, that would be a much closer game than it actually ended up being. But again, we'll get into that game here in just a moment. So overall for the weekend, a 5-4 record on the picks for a 2-week total of 8-5. If you remember back to week 1 in our PLL discussion, I went just straight up picks in that one, but now have decided since then that we'll do a little bit of betting talk here on the podcast, which with each of these Thursday episodes coming out in future weeks of the season here in the PLL. Now, to recap some Player Royale real quick before we get to those Week 2 matchups in the PLL. My team this week, I told you guys on Thursday who I had this week. Jeff Teat, Tom Schreiber, Michael Earhart, Trevor Baptiste, and Blaze Reardon were my 5. They went out, got me 97 combined points here in Week 2. My standing now in the overall leaderboards of PLL Player Royale, I am now up to 7th in the total standings, and some of my top performers from week 2 were Trevor Baptiste with 34 points, Jeff Teat with 22, and Tom Schreiber had a pretty solid week 2 after struggling a bit in week 1, came back, had a 2-point goal, and I believe 2 assists on the night in week 2 for a total of 16 fantasy points. So now to get into those week 2 matchups, as I mentioned, the Chrome started things out. They go to 2-0 on the year, beating the Redwoods pretty handily, 12-3, the final in that one. And when you look at just how dominant of a game the Chrome played against the Redwoods in that first matchup of the weekend, the Redwoods were minus 15 in ground balls, minus 16 in shots, minus 9 in shots on goal, but they were plus 7 in turnovers, and we're only 37% on faceoffs for the day. So obviously a very, and I mean very, tough go of it for them in week 2. And it's really just been a tough first couple of weeks for the Redwoods here in the PLL season. So through 2 games, they're averaging 20 turnovers per game. They're 41% on faceoffs, and this was a team that a year ago, largely behind T.D. Erlin, was one of the top 2, even top 3, especially face-off teams in the league, now facing off at just 41% through 2 weeks. And they're 22% shooting, which is tied for worst in the league. They're also last in scoring offense and scoring defense on top of all that. And when you really look at the struggles they're having offensively, and you talk about those 20 turnovers per game, just how much that's hurting this offense, you have certain players that have as many shots in 2 weeks as they do turnovers. You look at a guy like Matt Kavanaugh, has 9 turnovers while shooting 9% to start the year. And a guy like Jules Henningberg, I even had him on my fantasy team in week 1, had 4 goals on the weekend, but you look at even his play, has 6 shots in 2 weeks and already 6 turnovers to his credit so far through 2 games. So just when you talk about the struggles that this team is having, and we'll get more into it in segment 2 with the power rankings, but when you really look at this offense, they're compounding the horrible shooting so far to start the year with the elevated turnover numbers. You can't expect to win or even play relatively well, as they lost 12-3, like I mentioned, to the Chrome in week 2. You can't even begin to try and play well offensively when you guys when you have guys, that first of all aren't shooting the ball well, but second of all, they're now doubling down on the problem by turning it over just about as poorly as they're shooting. And one thing they did do, however, after week 2 is they went out and they picked up Sergio Salcido from the player pool, who was previously part of the trade for Miles Jones a couple of years back. And what I think he gives them is he gives them a midi that can dodge and make things happen. He can be a feeder within that offense, which is something you saw when he got traded from the Redwoods to the Chaos for Miles Jones. He was able to do that for a short stint with the Chaos, was able to be sort of a facilitator within that offense. They used him in a lot of two-man games, it seems, so maybe that's something the Redwoods now can take advantage of with him, because really what you've seen from them offensively through the first 2 weekends is it almost kind of reminds me of the 2020 Atlas offense, where there's just no ball movement, there's no creativity, and someone even this past weekend compared it on Twitter to almost watching like a summer men's league offense. Just a lot of guys standing around, not a whole lot happening, just everybody trying to win their individual matchups, and right now the Redwoods just aren't winning those individual matchups. The second game of the weekend was the Archers and the Chaos. The Archers winning 17-12 after losing in week 1 to the Chrome. A nice bounce back win for them. And I think that the game was a lot closer in the second half as the Chaos dug themselves into a 10-4 halftime deficit. And the Chaos actually won the face-off battle in this game, but allowed the Archers to shoot over 40% for the night. And whenever you allow an offense that's as deep as this one, and we've talked about it with the Atlas too, but when you allow offenses like that to shoot anywhere near 40% for a game, let alone over 40% in a game, it's going to be a long night for your defense and for your goalie in the cage, even with a guy like Blaze Reardon being the one in the cage in that instance. And the Chaos were able to take advantage of the power play in that game. The Archers got hit for a number of penalties throughout the night, and the Chaos, were able to capitalize on that, going 4 for 6 on the man up for the game. And the Archers offense, I think, definitely looked more like what we can and should expect from them, with, like I said before, with the talent that they have and as deep as they are offensively on that side of the field. And Schreiber had a really solid bounce back game. He had a 2-bomb and 2 assists while coming off a game where he went 0 for 4 shooting in week 1. The Atlas in the third game of the weekend, the first game on Saturday, the Atlas double up the Cannons 16-8. The Atlas used a couple of 4-0 quarters in that game to really pull away, as they they outscored the Cannons 4-0 in the second and fourth quarters, while you look at the first and third quarters were 4-4 in each of those quarters respectively. So again, they used those second and fourth quarters to really pull away in the end. Jeff Teed had 3 goals, 2 assists, which hit the over 4.5 in that game. Trevor Baptiste absolutely dominated at the stripe, going 20 of 24 with 12 ground balls. He also had a goal and an assist on the day. And I think that when you look at the Atlas offense, and we always talk about that family style, one thing that you did see, at least for one specific moment in that game, was that while Romar Dennis only shot 1 of 7 for the day, his goal was a really nice 2-ball on the run, kind of leaning in right at that line. They did go back and review it and say it was a 2-pointer after the review. But yeah, just a really nice play on the run. Just shows you what kind of a rocket he has of a shot. And he adds that outside shooting element to this team, where you've got guys like Jeff Teet, Chris Gray, Eric Law. They can kind of make things happen from within, 10, 8 yards and closer. But when you have a guy like Romar Dennis that can stretch things out and be taking shots from 10, 12, 15 yards, whatever it may be, that really opens things up well for your offense. So again, even though he only shot at 1 of 7 in that game, that one that he did get was an absolute beauty. And then you look at the cage for the Atlas. Jack Kincannon starting out the season really well, which I think they needed to see from him. He goes 61% in the game against the Cannons. He's 59% through essentially a game and a half is what he's played so far this year. J.D. Colarusso got the second half of their week 1 win against the Redwoods, and he's only giving up about 8 scores against per game so far, which is really solid. And again, that's the kind of start that if you're the Atlas and Ben Rubior that you wanted to see in the cage from Jack Kincannon. On the other side for the Cannons, Jake Fricaro did have the Cannons lone 2 in that game. He's looked really good for them to start the year from that midfield. And the Cannons, kind of similar to what we talked about in the game with the Redwoods and how much they struggled and how much some of those statistics really bared that out. You look at the Cannons in this game against the Atlas, they were minus 11 on ground balls and only won about 20% of the faceoffs against Trevor Baptiste. That shows you just how dominant he was in that game. And they also went 0 for 4 did the Cannons on the power play. And then the final game of week 2 in the PLL, the Whipsnakes again winning in a close one, this time in overtime, 12-11 the final. The Whipsnakes were down entering the fourth quarter of play 9-5 and used a 6-2 fourth quarter to send the game to overtime. Now the Water Dogs, I think, just couldn't convert in overtime. They had a couple of chances in that overtime period. They just couldn't find the back of the net. They kept giving the Whipsnakes opportunity after opportunity after opportunity until they finally converted on one that was the game winner. Jay Carlson and Michael Sowers really balled out in that game, going for 6 and 5 points respectively for their team. So just some really solid play from those two in that one. And the difference in the game was that the Water Dogs were minus 21 in ground balls. They went 15% on faceoffs. Now, a big reason why was because Jake Withers apparently went down early in that game with an injury. I wasn't tuned into the game at that point, but that's just what I heard on the broadcast. So that was a big reason why they went only 15% on the game. And the Whipsnakes went 2 for 2 on the power play, while the Water Dogs just 0 for 1. Now, my sort of, I guess you could say, hot take from that game and from week 2 is that the Whipsnakes might be 2-0, but I don't think they're going to keep winning games this way. I do think eventually they're going to just have to flat out outplay somebody and not just get a lucky bounce here and there as they keep doing and winning in overtime or winning in the final seconds like they did in week 1 against the Chaos. And I think that when you look at their week 3 matchup with a team like the Atlas, I think that's one of those matchups where they're finally going to be, I guess you could say, exposed in a way, and they're going to have to match the Atlas for 4 quarters, and I'll be interested to see just how they go about doing that, and if the Atlas can be that team that essentially exposes them and makes them play a complete game for 4 quarters. So coming up in segment 2, we'll get to the updated power rankings, and then later on in the final segment, we'll finish off getting your thoughts in the mix from week 2 in the PLL, but you're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. All right, welcome back. Segment 2 of Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Segment 1, we recapped some PLL Player Royale. We also broke down all 4 matchups from Week 2 in Premier Lacrosse action. Segment 2 will update the power rankings, and to jump right into it, I've got the Atlas still at number 1. They've been absolutely on fire out of the gate here in 2022 with no sign of slowing down at all. And it's really one of those things where we talk about it all the time. It's an everyone eats offense where everybody gets involved. It's that family style that we talk about. And the Atlas have the number one scoring offense while also leading the league in assists and shooting percentage through 2 weeks. So again, you just go back to that whole family style. Everybody gets involved. Everybody has a role. Everybody is doing their job and getting everybody else around them involved in making everyone around them better. And I think that just shows you just how good and how efficient that they've been through the first 2 games. They also have the league's number 2 scoring defense. They're also second in faceoff percentage and third in penalty kill. So again, they're doing a lot of those little things that lead to winning lacrosse. Jeff Teed also leads the league in points with 12, while Chris Gray leads rookies in points with 8, and they face a really tough task. As I kind of mentioned at the end of segment 1 there just a moment ago, they face a really tough task in week 3, matching up against the Whipsnakes. That'll be a game that I am definitely keeping an eye on here heading into week 3, is that Atlas Whipsnakes matchup. Number 2, I've got the Chrome because I said it in the preseason that it was, at this point, it's about winning in 2022 for the Chrome. It's no more of this, oh, well, this guy's hurt, or oh, these guys retired, or this, that, and the other thing. It's about finding a way to get it done on the field, and in 2 weeks, they've absolutely figured out how to do that. They've got these guys back healthy, and they're playing at an extremely high level at both ends of the field. They have the number 1 scoring defense in the league while also leading the league in caused turnovers and ground balls. They're third in face-off percentage behind just the Whipsnakes and the Atlas, and Brendan Nickturn is tied for third in rookie scoring with Asher Nolting, who they both have 5 points apiece in their rookie seasons so far. So I think the Chrome have shown, at least in the first 2 weeks, that they can be a top 4, top 5 team, that when these guys are healthy and playing at a high level, they are definitely a force to be reckoned with. So they are number 2 on this week's power rankings. Number 3, I have the Whipsnakes, because while the Whipsnakes haven't necessarily wowed me per se through the first 2 weeks, they found ways to win. And I think, going back to what I said about the Chrome, it's just finding ways to get it done on the field and to be able to come out with a W. And that's something that, whether you like it or not, whether you like the late game goals or you like the overtime close wins by the Whipsnakes or not, they are finding ways to do it. And they are one of 3 teams in the league currently at 2-0. Now, with that being said, with the Atlas and the Chrome also being 2-0 like the Whipsnakes, notice how I ranked the Whipsnakes last of those 3. The Whipsnakes did need a 9-5 second half run, plus multiple looks in overtime, as I mentioned back in segment 1, to win in week 2, and needed really a lucky bounce off a save by Matt DeLuca that led to a rebound score by Carlson to tie it up late. I believe there was about a minute and a half or so in regulation at that point. And the Whipsnakes turned it over a ton in that game, something that I think may have gone a little bit unnoticed there. They turned it over 26 times this weekend and are now tied for the lowest shooting percentage in the league. But I will say a bright spot for them is that the Whipsnakes are tied for second in scoring defense, and they're one of 3 teams currently with a sub-10 scores against average defensively. Number 4, I've got the Cannons, because I thought they looked pretty solid in week 1 against the Water Dogs. I think they did a lot of things right there, and they battled against the Atlas without Lyle Thompson in the lineup, and I talked about it segment 1. You look at some of those stretches in the second and fourth quarters where the Atlas outscored them a combined 8-0 in those quarters. They at one point had a 4-1 lead early in that game against the Atlas, and they tied things up in the first and third quarters. Combined 8-for-8 was the score in those 2 quarters. So again, 2 quarters they played it really tight. 2 quarters, they kind of let things slip away from them a little bit. And like I said, they did at one point in the first quarter have a 4-1 lead on the Atlas early. The Cannons have players like Asher Nolting contributing well offensively, and their goaltending is also ranked first in the league with a league best 32 saves. And they can also improve on a couple things I think that would help them here in these power rankings and overall standings in the PLL as well. And really that comes in two areas. The first is that they're 7th at the stripe at 38%, and that was something coming into the year I said they needed to be better at. And so far they're kind of at where they were a year ago percentage-wise, and they're also 7th in the PLL in power play at just 17%. I believe I saw they're converting on 1 of 6 to start the year. Number 5, I have the Archers, because while the Cannons, I think, are flipped in the standings with the Archers currently due to goal differential, this is, for me at least, more of the eye test thing. And I think that depending on how week 3 goes here in a couple days this weekend, 4 and 5 on this list can easily be flipped, where you could see the Archers move up to 4 and the Cannons bump down to 5. I think the offense for the Archers got back on track in week 2 a bit, shooting over 40% and had 7 different players scoring goals in that game. The Archers also showed some range, hitting a couple twos in that game and assisted on over half their goals in that one. And I think it's kind of ironic that the Archers and the Cannons actually will meet each other in week 3 to decide who gets that sort of 4 and 5 spot in the standings. So we'll see how those two spots look on Monday's episode and the power rankings there. Number 6, I've got the Chaos, because I think similar to spots 4 and 5 on these rankings, spots 6 and 7 could also go either way, because I think that the Chaos have battled hard without some of those key names offensively, guys like Dane Smith and Josh Byrne especially, including taking the Whips to the very end in week 1. They scored that goal with about 3 or 4 seconds left in regulation to win it. And I think that despite Blaze Reardon struggling in week 2, by his standards, I would say struggling, he still made 10 saves in that game and actually was able to dish out an assist on the night as well. So the Chaos have the league's top power play and penalty kill, which I think in this league, your ability to do that is really solid, while their goaltending still, despite, again, the struggles sort of that Reardon faced in week 2 against the Archers, is still a top 3 spot in the league. And I think once they get some of those guys back from the NLL championships, like Josh Byrne and Dane Smith, they should be just fine. Number 7, I've got the Water Dogs, because like I said before, teams 6 and 7 have both suffered close losses to the Whipsnakes to start the year, and both have losses of 5 or more to start the year. 5 or more scores, that is, to start the year. The Water Dogs statistically are a very mid team when you actually look at it. They're a middle of the pack offense. They're 7th in scoring defense. They're last in faceoff percentage, although like I said in segment 1, a lot of that probably due to the fact that Jake Withers got hurt in that week 2 matchup. They're last in power play and last in penalty kill. So they don't really have that sort of built-in excuse, I guess you could say, that the Chaos do with some of those guys out in the NLL playoffs, because really they're only missing Dylan Ward in those NLL championships. So they should be, I guess, at least to this point, a little bit better off than what they've shown so far. And then the last spot, number 8 in the power rankings, are the Redwoods. They lead the league in turnovers while having the worst shooting percentage. They're tied with the Whipsnakes for the worst shooting percentage. And they have the fewest scores. They're second in, they have the second fewest shots total, fewest shots on goal. They're tied for the fewest ground balls, 6th in faceoff percentage, and the league's worst scoring defense. So I think it's safe to say that for the Redwoods right now, not much has really gone right for them to start the year. Their offense is now drawing comparisons, like I said before in segment 1, they're drawing comparisons to the Atlas offense of 2020, where there was just no ball movement, there was no creativity, there's a lot of standing around and just taking bad shots, and they're turning the ball over a lot. So again, like I said, not a lot really going right for the Redwoods at this point, although they did pick up, as I said in segment 1, they picked up Sergio Salcido from the player pool, maybe try to shake things up a little bit offensively, just try to get something, some chemistry or energy or whatever it needs to be offensively to try and get them out of this slump. So coming up, final segment of the show, segment 3, we'll get your thoughts in the mix to recap week 2 in the Premier Lacrosse League, but you're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Welcome back. Final segment of the show here on a Tuesday. Monday's usual episode being pushed to Tuesday this week, but final segment here on Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. We'll get your thoughts in the mix on week 2 in the PLL. At Stevie Mack Media is my Twitter handle for all show and PLL related content and discussions. I went to Twitter to get your thoughts from this past weekend. Michael Ramirez says the Atlas offense, pick your poison, but the defense looks more dialed in and physical this year. Baptiste is on another planet, and is it possible for a faceoff guy to win the MVP if he keeps this up all summer? So yeah, he has another point that I'll get to in a second, but to get to this initial thought, more so focused on the Atlas. Yeah, it's something that we talk about time and time again. This is a everybody eats family style of offense. Everybody is going to have their opportunity to put up big numbers. Everybody is going to play their role within this offense. And yeah, their defense definitely looks, as he says, more dialed in this year. They just look so fast, so physical. And I think when you have guys like Cade Van Raphorst and Kobe Smith, and guys that can just fly around that end of the field. Kobe Smith, we saw, got his first PLL goal in week 2 as well, coming out in transition. So yeah, when you have athletes at both ends of the field that can get up and down and make plays the way that this team does, it does make them that much harder to match up with. He says Baptiste is on another planet, and is it possible for a faceoff guy to win the MVP? Yeah, I think you look back to last season even and how TD Erlin came out that first half of the year. People started having that discussion even back then about could TD Erlin win MVP for his play at the stripe, or at the very least, could he be the rookie of the year? So I think that if Baptiste comes out and continues to be at the level he's at now, he's somewhere around 70% right now through 2 weeks. I don't think that that's necessarily sustainable over the course of the entire summer, but if he is able to go, even 60-65% for the entire season, that could put him in the conversation as a league MVP, especially if he's able to come out and get a point or two per week and be racking up the ground balls like he did this past weekend with 12 ground balls in that game against the Cannons. So yeah, I think when he puts together an all-around effort like what we've seen these first 2 weeks, where he's facing off at a high percentage, he's contributing points to the offense, he's getting those ground balls and things like that. If he's able to put together those kinds of performances week in and week out, yeah, I definitely think you could start to see him in that conversation for league MVP. His other comment says, after hearing Rabel talk about Belichick, meaning Bill Belichick, open to coaching a team, it makes the mind think, what team lands him? Yeah, this was an interesting thing that I saw on social media yesterday or 2 days ago now about him talking about Bill Belichick and some conversations that he claims that they've had in the past, and that he's shown interest in coming over to the PLL after retiring from the NFL, obviously from coaching with the Patriots, about coming to the PLL and coaching a team in the future. I definitely think that would absolutely be noteworthy, to say the least. If nothing else, it would be noteworthy, kind of similar to when Chris Hogan made the jump from the NFL to the PLL for a year and played a couple games in the PLL last year, and how much attention there was around social media about that move. I think this move, if it were to happen in the next couple of years, would be that times about 1 million, to be honest with you. I think that when people talked about Hogan, it was for about 48, maybe 72 hours. If Belichick was to make a move like this in the next couple of years, people would be talking about that for weeks, if not months, I would think, just because of who he is and the scope that he's had around the NFL for decades now, essentially. But I do think it's interesting because when he started his coaching career in the NFL back as an intern with the Lions in the 70s, he actually was a coach for a local high school lacrosse team in the area, Detroit Country Day, and they are a fantastic program here in the state of Michigan at the high school level. They just participated in championship weekend here in Michigan this past weekend in boys state lacrosse championships. So yeah, he is a big fan of the game. He has coached at least in a previous coaching lifetime a while back. So yeah, I definitely think that that's something that if he's interested in doing it and the league is interested in bringing him on at some point, it would be really cool to see somebody of his caliber being a part of this league in any shape or form, really, whether it's as a coach or as just an ambassador or whatever the case may be. Now, from Coach Schreck, he says at this point, nobody's position is safe on the Redwoods until the team starts showing improvement. However, if the Redwoods should fall to 0-3, is Coach Nat going to be on the hot seat? So Schreck has a couple more points I'll get to in just a second, but to touch on this first one, he says at this point, nobody's position is safe on the Redwoods until the team starts showing improvement. Yeah, and I think that when you talk about the turnovers that they've had and the horrible shooting percentages that some of these guys have come out with to start the year, it's easy to say that nobody's job is safe, that you have to do something as a coach, whether it's schematically, whether it's personnel-wise, you have to do and try something and anything to get something going offensively. And I do think that the addition of Sergio Salcido back to this roster from the player pool is potentially a start to that. I think maybe getting Perkovic back and healthy, hopefully in the near future, will help in that regard as well and give them some of that outside shooting again with guys like Perkovic, Miles Jones. We've seen Nakai Montgomery can shoot it from the outside as well. Now you add in a dodging playmaker like Salcido to that offense, maybe takes a little bit of that pressure off their attack as they've had some of those turnover issues to start the year. And as far as his comment about if they start 0-3, does that put Nat St. Laurent on the hot seat? I don't know if it immediately does, but depending on how the rest of the season plays out and whether or not the Redwoods actually make the playoffs at this point or not, I think that's when you start to see in the offseason, especially if they don't make the playoffs this year, if they're that team on the outside looking in September, that's when I think you start to really have that deep dive and you look into whether or not he is your guy moving forward. But do they do so after starting 0-3? I don't think so, because you even go back the last 2 years with a team like the Chaos and their slow starts to the year and how that turned out for them. Could that be what we see with the Redwoods here in 2022? He says the Whipsnakes won't ever sweat close 1-goal games. And yeah, that's something that I talked about at the top of the show too. And there was a response to this on Twitter. Somebody else responded to this comment from Shrek, and I think it pretty much sums it up really well. They said that this one gets me the most heated. It's how they're bred at Maryland. They're professional, surgical, cool under pressure. They're never really out of it. And when they need a W, they just put it in Rambo's hands and let him work. It's infuriating to a hater like myself. And I'm not saying that I'm necessarily a hater like this person said they were, but you do start to wonder, as I said top of the show, whether or not they can sustain some of these close 1-goal kind of sweated out type of games when they match up with a team like they will in week 3 in the Atlas, because against a team like that, you will have to play a solid all-around game for a full 4 quarters, and you can't be turning it over 26 times against a team like the Atlas like they did this past weekend against the Water Dogs and expect to win. So I do think that eventually it will come back to bite them at some point in time this season. And then he says, the Chromes win this past weekend. Is it too early to cast my vote for Brendan Nichtern as Rookie of the Year in the PLL? Yeah, he's one of those rookies that's had a really solid start to the year, and he does contribute heavily to this Chrome team. But I think when you look at a guy like Chris Gray, who currently leads all rookies in scoring with 8 points through 2 weeks, it's tricky because you look at a guy, you compare these two and what they are in terms of the overall offense of their teams. Chris Gray is more of just a piece to that offense. He's a part of a much larger picture, whereas I think a guy like Nick Turn has the opportunity to really establish himself in the Chrome's offense and be a much bigger factor in that offense than maybe a Chris Gray in the Atlas. But yeah, I definitely think that Nick Turn can be, along with a guy like Asher Nolting, with Chris Gray, can be a part of that Rookie of the Year conversation in the PLL moving forward. But that'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, an absolutely loaded episode here, recapping week 2 in the PLL. Thursday's episode will be previewing everything PLL heading into week 3 of the regular season. You can check out the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, including Apple, Google, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and now Stitcher as well in the mix. But that'll do it for me. I'll talk to you guys later.